As Professor Cummins says, I'm discussing human motivation in the tripartite soul, and I'm introducing the concept of the self. I'm going to be using books 4, 8, 9, and 10. Book 4 introduces the tripartite soul, along with the metaphor of the city, which is the construction of a particular type of city, mimics the construction of a particular type of soul. Book 8 expands upon that and introduces the devolution of the aristocratic soul to the tamarchic soul, to the oligarchic soul, to the democratic soul. And then Book 9 focuses on the devolution from the democratic soul to the tyrant. Book 10 has some concluding remarks on the soul and also has the myth of error. In this paper, I will be introducing the concept of the self, which is what you think of when you think of a person, and I'm arguing that the 3 different parts of the soul are parts of a whole. So it's not 3 independent people existing within the soul. Also, the self is responsible for the construction of the soul. It's responsible for how the soul is arranged. So, Socrates creates the 3 parts of the soul out of conflicting motivation. There's the example, this is number 1 on your handout. Isn't there something in their soul bidding them to drink and something different forbidding them to do so that overrules the thing that bids? So from conflicting motivation within the soul, Socrates determines that there are at least 2 different types, or 2 different parts of a soul, and through more deliberation, he determines that there are in fact 3 different parts of the soul. He admits that there may be more, but 3 parts of the soul is what he discusses for the rest of the Republic. The first part of the soul is the rational part of the soul, and it is the part with which we calculate. It exercises foresight on behalf of the whole soul. If you look at number 2 on your handout, it's logistikon. The root word is logos, meaning reason, and this indicates that this part of the soul has the capacity to reason. It's important to note that the rational part of the soul has desires. So the word for somebody who has the rational part of their soul ruling is a philosopher. So philia is the first part of that word, and philia is generally translated as love, but it's not necessarily love in how we think of it. It's more of a seeking love. It's more of a desirous love. And so you could also translate a philosopher to be a seeker of wisdom. If you notice in handout number 3, it says there are 3 primary kinds of people: the philosophic, the victory-loving, and the profit-loving. And so here Socrates is demonstrating, I believe, that you can distinguish the rational part of the soul by its desire for wisdom. Socrates makes it clear that it's the responsibility of the rational part of the soul to produce justice and to establish the parts of the soul in a natural relation, it is in a well-structured soul. One should produce justice by establishing the parts of the soul in a natural relation of control. So it's not simply how things should be, it's actually natural for the rational part of the soul to rule. The second part of the soul is often seen as like the middle part of the soul. It's the spirited part, and it is a thing that is anger-like. It also is the thing behind a fiery temperament, is the way you could think about it. This part has less cognition than the rational part of the soul, which is obviously the calculative part of the soul, so it has full cognition. However, this part is seen a little bit more animalistically. Socrates refers to this part of the soul as a shepherd's dog, called to heel by a shepherd, and the shepherd would be reason. So when unrestrained by reason, the spirited part will fight to achieve what the spirited part believes is right. However, it will do so until it dies. So it has the ability to recognize what is right or what it thinks is right. However, it doesn't have the calculative ability that the rational part holds to determine at what point it should stop. The desires of the spirited part are for honor and victory. So again, number 3 on the handout, you'll see that it's a victory lover is how it's distinguished. The desires for the spirited part make it well suited to do its job, and its job is defending the soul from external forces and also defending the rational part of the soul from the appetitive part of the soul. So Socrates kind of creates this civil war within the soul where the spirited part takes the side of the rational part against the appetitive part. And the appetitive part of the soul is the part that lusts, hunger, thirsts, and gets excited by other similar appetites. It's made of the person's bodily desires, which is distinguished from the rational part of the soul, which is made up of the soul's desires, you could say. So basically, the rational part recognizes a lack in the soul, and a lack is always going to be filled by truths and knowledge. So that's why the rational part of the soul seeks wisdom, whereas the appetitive part of the soul recognizes bodily lacks and seeks to fill those with food or whatever else would fill the bodily lacks. The extent of Socrates refers to the appetitive part as the irrational part. It has enough knowledge or ability to recognize when there is a lack in the body and how to fill it, but that's pretty much all it can do. It's the least calculative or least rational part. If you see on handout number 5, epithumedikon is the word for it. Epithumia is the root word for that, and that just means desire. So I think of the appetitive part of the soul to be the part that holds desire, or in fact is desire, or is those bodily desires. So for example, Plato or Socrates often refers to the appetitive part as simply the desires. So the calculative part is the part of the soul that calculates, the spirited part is the part that gets angry, and the appetitive part is the part that desires, despite the fact that they all desire. It's often said, or Socrates often calls the appetitive part the money-seeking part, and I just want to clarify real quickly. He says that the reason it's money-seeking, that's not necessarily originally its primary desire. What happens is that the appetitive part recognizes that money can get it what it wants to fill its bodily lack, and so it desires money secondarily, and then eventually it turns into a primary desire. So I'm introducing the concept of a self. Basically, there are 3 different parts of the soul. That's clear in the text. However, it's a little bit unclear as to what is a person then. Like, are we 3 different things? Are we one thing with 3 things inside of us? It's unclear. I'm arguing that we have a concept of the self, and that's who the person is, and the 3 different parts of the soul are parts of a whole. So it is with the calculative part of the soul that the person thinks, is how you should think about it. A lot of secondary sources allude to this, even if they don't argue it outright, just simply through their language. So for example, Cooper alludes to this by saying that the appetite and the reason are driving the agent to drink or not to drink. So while Cooper isn't necessarily arguing for this concept of a self as I think of it, the language still indicates it's really hard to get around the language to argue something different. So the self is responsible for arranging the soul, so if the rational part is ruling, the self has put the rational part on the throne of the soul. And so if you see on your handout number 6, he puts himself in order as his own friend and harmonizes the 3 parts of himself like limiting notes in a musical scale. So this quote, if you just pay consideration to the word he, it's somebody who's doing this. It's somebody who is putting the rational part of the soul on the throne. And people argue against this. Moline claims that Socrates' discussion of the parts of the soul warring for power indicates that they can't just simply be seen as functions, and they need to be seen as like essentially tiny people inside of a soul with complete motivations and complete agency because they're warring. However, I think if you look at book 4 in conjunction with books 8 and 9 and even 10, there's enough evidence that we can take that to be more poetic language. The actual warring within the soul can be seen more as poetic language than as an actual struggle where things have agency within the soul. If you look at number 7 on the handout, don't you think that this type of person this is about the oligarchy persons, don't you think that this type of person would establish his appetitive and money-making parts on the throne, setting it up as a great king within himself? He makes the rational and spirited parts sit on the ground beneath appetite on either side, reducing them to slaves. So again, this is the use of the he. He is doing this. It is not that there's some civil war happened and the appetitive parts overruled or took over from the spirited part. The next line is, he won't allow the first to reason about anything or examine anything except how little money can be made into a great wealth. And he won't allow the second to value or admire anything but wealth and wealthy people, or to have any ambition other than the acquisition of wealth or whatever might contribute to getting it. So there's a lot of specific language in the text. This is how Socrates talks about the soul. This is how Socrates talks about the soul devolving, is by using this he. And I think furthermore in book 9, becomes clear that not only is this he or is this person or this self responsible for putting the soul in order, it's also responsible for fulfilling the desires of each particular part of the soul. So, for example, Socrates says, what about the spirited part? Mustn't similar things happen to someone who satisfies it? So it is the self who is able to satisfy the desires of the spirited part. The spirited part doesn't have enough agency to be able to satisfy its own desires. All it can do is desire. And Socrates, number 8 on your handout. Socrates has a few different lines with the self-reflexive terminology. So he finds self-control, the concept of self-control, to be a problem because he argues, like, what is controlling what? If you're a person, then how can you control yourself? Like, it has to be one person controlling another. But I think using this concept of the self, we can see that is, in fact, the self that is arranging its own parts, and it's not like different people within the soul. So we run into a few problems with the concept of motivation, however, because how can the self decide how to arrange the soul? For example, the self uses the 3 different parts, or doesn't. The 3 different parts supply abilities to the self that the self doesn't have independent of the 3 different parts. For example, it is the spirited part with which the self gets angry, and the appetitive part with which the self lusts. The self can't do these things without, like, independently of the 3 different parts. So how can it hold the motivation to overthrow one part of the soul and place another part of the soul on the throne? First, there's a component of nature involved with this. So Socrates thinks that in fact, the majority of people are more naturally inclined to have the appetitive part of their soul ruling. Socrates says, in relation to somebody who is a philosopher, you meet with the desires that are simple, measured, and directed by calculation in accordance with understanding and correct belief, only in the few people who are born with the best natures and receive the best education. So people have to be born with a specific nature, and that will certainly influence the way that the soul is going to be structured. However, nature doesn't completely explain how the soul, or how the self overturns one part of the soul. There's a problem, a big problem, and this is on quote 9 on your handout. The son loses his property and, fearing for his life, immediately drives from the throne in his soul the honor-loving and spirited parts that rule there. Humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to making money, and little by little, saving and working, he amasses property. Don't you think that this person would establish his appetitive and money-making part on the throne, setting it up as a great king within himself, and adorning it with golden tiaras and collars, and girding it with Persian swords? So clearly this is a huge problem, because the self has actually thrown the spirited part off of the throne and put the appetitive part on the throne. So how did it develop the motivation to do this? Because surely the spirited part wouldn't supply the motivation. The spirited part is the part that was on the throne. Surely, even though it was ruling, it would never supply the motivation to be itself overthrown, and it would never supply the motivation to put the appetitive part on the throne. There are a few different solutions to this, but I think the most convincing solution is that the solution to this is mainly found in Book 8, and it involves the strength of the different parts of the souls. So the different parts of the souls are nourished by different things. Even someone who is naturally inclined to have the rational part rule must engage in education and physical training in order to strengthen the rational part of the soul and have it be a proper ruler. When describing the devolution of the son, the aristocratic son, into the tamarchic man, Socrates says, his father nourishes the rational part of his soul and makes it grow. The others nourish the spirited and appetitive parts. So there can be sort of nourishing through education. It also is influenced by the people that they are around, the people who raise them, their upbringing in general, can strengthen different parts of the soul. More evidence for this can be found in the transition from the oligarchic man to the democratic son. When this transformation happens, one party of his desires receives help from external desires that are akin to them and of the same form. So when a part of the soul is strengthened by usually outside forces, education, etc., that is when the self can take on the motivation of, for example, in the case of the oligarchic man, though the spirited part was on the throne, the oligarchic man went through this great turmoil in his life. Perhaps that strengthened the appetitive part of his soul. And so then he took on the motivation of the appetitive part of his soul, overthrew the spirited part, and placed the appetitive part on the throne. There is a complication with the democratic man, and that is freedom. The democratic man desires freedom, but the problem is that there is no part of the soul that actually holds the desire for freedom, and freedom itself never sits on the throne. So, quote number 10. And so he lives on, yielding day by day to the desire at hand. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to the flute. At other times he drinks only water and is on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training, and at other times he's idle and neglects everything. And sometimes he even occupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. So this is a description of the behavior of a democratic man. And the idea is that he should be desiring freedom. Socrates claims that he desires freedom above all. In fact, he considers freedom to be the good. However, no part of the soul is providing the motivation for freedom for him. And in fact, all of these different desires are taking turns. There is nothing in his soul that is allowing him, or that is providing the motivation to allow the different desires to take turns on the throne. We just saw with the oligarchic man that once a desire is on the throne, it will rule the other parts as slaves. And so the fact that these desires are taking turns seems impossible. Now, Cooper argues that this is because, in fact, the appetitive part is simply ruling here. He says that when Socrates says that the man engages in philosophy, this is a brutish type of philosophy, and it simply feels good to him, so he decides to do it, but it's a purely appetitive motivation. So we have the appetitive part on the throne. But this causes problems because the appetitive part isn't simply just a cohesive part. There are different subdivisions within the appetitive part. We see this with the oligarchic man, because the oligarchic man only satisfies his necessary desires in his drive to accrue money. So all of the unnecessary desires are still being suppressed. So if the appetitive part is simply ruling, there's all these contradicting behavior that even if the appetitive part was ruling, surely it would have to be just one part of the appetitive part, because the behavior is contradictory, and therefore it doesn't make sense that we can just call this the appetitive part ruling. I think based on textual evidence, which indicates that there is no part of the soul on the throne specifically, and all desires are attended to at different times, I believe that the interest in philosophy is actually a predictable sign that the rational part is having its turn. Socrates says that all of the desires take turns. It makes sense that the rational part's desires would also take turns. This still has not solved the issue with freedom, though. And I think Socrates recognizes this issue with freedom, and I think that is why he introduces the concept of eros in the tyrant. So the democratic man devolves into the tyrant. So the democratic man has desired freedom, but all of these desires don't have something motivating them, holding the motivation for them to be able to take turns on the throne. Eros provides that motivation. However, it's somewhat of a surprise for several reasons. First, Eros is presented as this frenzied, insatiable, desirous thing, which isn't necessarily how Eros has been presented in other Platonic texts. Additionally, it's placed within the soul of the tyrant by external forces. The way a man becomes a tyrant is a group of tyrant makers inject Eros into the person and essentially create a fourth part of the soul. And so this fourth part of the soul, this Eros, is contrived, but it is contrived to be the leader of those. This is 11 on your handout. Contrived to be the leader of those idle desires that spend whatever is at hand, and it's a leader to gather the desires and hold the motivation to satisfy all of them. So, while the injection of Eros is deliberately done and doesn't seem to be something that would have naturally happened if it weren't for the tyrant makers in the discussion of the soul, and despite the fact that the injection of Eros has created an entire new part of the soul, and despite the fact that Eros doesn't look exactly like it has looked in other Platonic texts, Eros does solve the problem of the democratic man, and I think that is potentially why Socrates included Eros in the tyrant. Book 10 contains a brief discussion on the soul, followed by the myth of Ur. One element of this discussion is claiming that the soul is immortal, and Socrates goes through a series of questions to determine that the soul is immortal. Some secondary sources, some Platonic scholars consider Socrates says that when the soul is admired in human life, that's what he's talking about with the tripartite soul, and so we don't know the soul's true form because we can't see it when it's not within, embodied. And so a lot of Platonic scholars consider that the myth of which is an afterlife myth, all of the dead people who have moved to the afterlife are exhibiting the true form of the soul because they are no longer embodied. I don't think this is true. So the reason for this is that each soul is not behaving remotely flawlessly. You would assume that if a soul was in its true nature, it would have relinquished all of the earthly influences on it, and it would be living its like purest form. However, all of the souls in the afterlife are behaving as if they are completely immersed in human life still. There's a process through which there are a bunch of lives on tablets laid down on the ground, and you can choose your next life in a reincarnation process. A man decides to be a swan because he doesn't want to be given birth to by a woman because he hates women. Like, clearly he's still being influenced by his time on Earth. Another man chooses the life of a tyrant only because he chooses unwisely. He didn't read the entire tablet. He didn't recognize what he was getting into, and as it turns out, he's destined to eat his own children. And he becomes very upset, understandably, but he starts blaming everybody but himself, despite the fact that he was very heavily warned to make a careful choice. So, the fact that the life events are still influencing their behavior is indicative of the fact that they are still immersed in human life and not the true form of the soul. So while many people think that we're not dealing with the tripartite soul anymore in the myth of I think we still are. There's another problem with the life-choosing process. That is that everything about your life, or almost everything about your life, is written on the lot that you choose for your next life, including wealth, poverty, sickness, health, and many other things. This is a problem because it sounds like your life is determined, and it seemed as though Plato was talking about, or was arguing that one should carefully arrange their soul for the entire Republic up until this point. It seems like an argument for being careful in arranging your soul, but if somebody's life is completely determined, then they have no chance to arrange their soul. And possibly Socrates is indicating that a person doesn't have as much control over the arrangement of their soul as would allow them to choose any formation at all, and so does not have complete control over the soul's arrangement. However, I don't think this is in the spirit of what Socrates is saying. And this, I think that the myth of is a myth, and Socrates considers it to be a myth, and we should take it as such and not get bogged down in the intricacies. If you look at number 12 on your handout, it says, the arrangement of the soul was not included in the model of life because the soul is inevitably altered by the different lives it chooses. This is a confusing line. It seems deterministic in the idea that the souls are inevitably altered by the lives chosen. However, if the lives were completely determined, the soul's arrangement would in fact be on the lots because there would be no possibility for any other option. I think this confusion shows that Socrates is not concerned with the intricacies of the lots, but is more concerned with the idea that the structure of the soul is not predetermined. Socrates wraps up the myth of and the Republic with the concept of happiness. If we practice justice and reason in every way, he says, we'll do well and be happy. While there are some intricacies that don't align in the myth of the reader should be concerned less with the intricacies than with the main message of the myth. Socrates says that as long as someone pursues philosophy in a sound manner while he is on Earth, he will not only be happy on Earth, but his passage through the afterlife will be smooth. There is considerable discussion in the Republic about the influences on a person's parents, the other people they surround themselves with, their upbringing and education, and even nature, all play a role to limit the structural choices one can make. Despite all of these factors that are out of control of the person, it is still, I think, that Socrates is arguing that it is still within someone's power to align their soul well, and if they do so, they will live well and be happy.